Because we fell just slightly behind, what we're going to do is simply run until 10:30 instead of 10:20 as scheduled on the handout, so that we have time for conversation. We'll start with members of the committee, and then we'll look to see if there's opportunity for others to be asking questions. I'm going to take the privilege of being a co-moderator to start it off, and ask if we can press you further after what were really some very thoughtful and thought-provoking presentations in two particular respects. Several of you, in both the kind of philosophical and in the theological context, talked about the importance of children and of having a biological child, and you, of course, mentioned it too as well. I wonder if I can press you to talk a little bit about what the difference is, if any, between the sense of genetic connection you have with your nieces and nephews, who of course also share your genes and who also are a reflection of you and your family, as opposed to in your own personal offspring. I mean, understanding the importance of genetic connection, to try to press you a little bit further on which kinds of genetic connections, if any, are special as opposed to others, talking now about the nuclear DNA. And the second is on the kinship question. If the mitochondrial DNA is used for anthropological tracing of ancestry, or in some cases for certain theological purposes in tracing ancestry, does that or should that compel us to use the same definition for social purposes? Or can the notion of ancestry be entirely different in social definitions as opposed to the ones that we use for tracing the movement of populations across centuries? And all of you talked to one extent or another about these things, so I think anybody who cares to respond would be fine.
Thanks, Alta. I think the answer to your second question is yes. We can have quite different conceptions of looking at population movements and trends, and also how to regard the relationship. I mean, in The Worth of a Child, I mean, I wrote a whole chapter about adoption as, a very important way of matching children in need of rearing parents and parents with a desire to have to care for and raise children. So I think many people may overestimate the relative importance of that direct genetic connection. Your question was framed very provocatively and well, I think. But I think, on the other hand, I want to respect the way in which that is a very important thing to many people. And certainly the decisions that have been made as we've guided, not just in the U.S., where I think, again, the policy response has been hopefully inadequate, hopelessly inadequate, but in the UK, where I think it's actually been reasonably sensible and well regulated, there's a great deal of deference given to the desire of adults who want to raise a child that has a direct genetic connection to them. And I'm not prepared to overrule that.
Could I? Sorry, just a really interesting thing that I found it really interesting during the course of our work as we were listening to evidence in preparing our report, was somebody, and I think this struck the committee quite forcefully, somebody who reflected on how a generation or two ago we wouldn't have talked about genetic connections, but blood connections, but blood being the connection. And then now we have a different language which is about genetics. And I agree with Tom that if we're looking at the different contexts, then we may define them or describe them in different ways. But that's because they are necessarily complex. And the way that we construct families and kinship are necessarily complex things. And this was the thing that struck me very forcefully, was how in the past we would have talked about how bloodline or blood connection was really, really important. And now we talk about how genetic connection can be really important. We can say simultaneously and hold the view at the same time that a genetic connection is really, really important and not at all relevant. We can embrace both of those things, and I don't think we can say to somebody who finds a genetic connection important that they shouldn't. But also we know that social relationships, family relationship, kinships can be constructed without genetic connections as well.
So I want to say a few things in response to your good question. One is that there is no sense in traditional scriptural texts that the child has to be genetically related to, because they didn't understand about genes, right? And hence the use of surrogates all over the early phases of Genesis in that narrative, and hence the use of multiple wives. So the idea was, it was based on this idea of the homunculus, right? That could be planted in anyone. So the actual, in that sense, that lineage is broken and reassembled many times in the scripture. Secondly, two things have changed, and that gives us a different context for this particular debate. They've even changed since the 2000 AAAS report that many of you participated in, thinking through this very question. One is families have changed more dramatically in my lifetime than at most points in human history. It's been a rapid and dramatic change in what it means to be a family. And two is our genetic capacity has changed. What we know genetically, what we think we know, the mapping of the human genome and the capacity to manipulate the genome, the growing success in procedures that we see at the RAC shows that that's changed wildly as well. So those two things necessarily, I think, will shift ideas of kinship, but kinship is, as everyone here has said, a deeply socially constructed idea. There's a tangential issue for Jewish ancestry tracing. They use the use of the mtDNA, as they referred to trace Jewish heritage. And that's been very popular and interesting. It's one of the many reasons that I think you don't want to erase the participation of a donor, because of the importance of maintaining separate identities and separate lineages. When a child is adopted in Judaism and in Islam, the child maintains its parental heritage. It doesn't become your child, right? And it's different than American law, but in halakhic law and in Sharia law, it has to be maintained to honor the heritage of that particular child, to honor the existence of a prior family. And that's why inheritance laws are of such importance in both Sharia law and in halakha.
Well, I feel a little left out here since I can't talk about my own children in public. So, however, that's right, over coffee later.
On the record, Kevin, be careful.
However, I can talk about my nieces and nephews, one of whom is adopted. And I consider her just as much a niece and nephew as the other members who are, of course, more closely related to me genetically. But I think that also raises part of this dynamic that is being expressed by the other members of the panel, too. And I'd like to just broaden that a little bit, because I do think a rapid expanse of the knowledge that we have of the role of genetics and now epigenetics and all these other parts is also challenging other social constructs that we have held dear, whether they've been held well or not, such as race. I mean, go back to the 1950s. That was considered to be as biologically as parent as anything could possibly be. And now we have a great deal of genetic information to enlighten us to the fact that members of the same race may be genetically more diverse than people who are of different races. So I think we are in a time of transition where we're still socially trying to integrate all this rapid expanse of our scientific knowledge. And so I don't want to say, that the concepts that people have held dear, right, should not be respected. But I think at the same time we have to acknowledge science is challenging those concepts. And so just to say that we want to hold them dear because we used to hold them dear isn't enough. I mean, we have to constantly integrate science into our overall worldviews, which is always why I love to be on a panel with Laurie, because she can give all the theological stuff, which I know nothing about. I'll just stick with the genetics. So.
I'll answer the niece question. So I have two nieces, and I love them very, very dearly. They're actually my brother's children, and they do not have melas. I do believe, however, that it's very important, if we have the option, to be able to give mothers with melas the option to have healthy children. We have the technology. We need to study it. And I think it's a huge disservice to women who have this disease to not give them that option. And that's really how I feel about that. I do love my nieces, but again, they're not mine. They're raised by my sister-in-law. So I think that's a very important distinction.
So you've got Jeff. You want to Jeff, Marni, and I'd like to be on the list too, so let's do it in that order.
Thank you
Jeff
for just
Botkin.
terrific presentations, and I do hope we get something in follow-up so we can pour through those in a little bit more detail. Central to this whole challenge, of course, is that we're in a sort of a cloud of uncertainty about a variety of aspects of the enterprise here. I see one of those uncertainties is about what the value is of having children that are genetically related to the mom. So one of the questions really trying to explore a little bit more about that notion. But we also, of course, have uncertainty about what the prospects are, what the risks are for the children who would be born of these procedures. So we're trying to balance those two concepts. So I want to take a sort of a counterfactual circumstance and look at it in a little different way. And that's to say, let's imagine we're 20 years down the road. We have some information about the risk. And let's imagine what those data show at that point, that kids born of these procedures have a 5% probability of a, let's say, autism spectrum disorder. Again, no data to this, but so I'm making it up. But I want to try to get a little closer to how we might balance the risks and benefits here. So let's imagine we have that information. So I'm particularly interested in Heather and Tom's thoughts, but anybody else. How would you then balance the risks and benefits of this enterprise with that type of data?
So I'll go ahead and start. I think that there's risks and benefits associated with any treatment. So, chemotherapy was cited as one. Any specific drug that's given in a clinical trial or even after it's been approved has specific side effects, and it's classified. Those side effects are identified, but without the clinical trials to perform to see if it is in fact a able procedure, I think that it's associated with anything. So a 5% risk is a 5% risk, but I don't believe that because there is a 5% risk, it should eliminate you from being able to do that, and I would still take that risk on.
Well, we now have 2 data points. This committee is going to ask very sharp and difficult questions, so you continue the tradition, Jeff. I'm not surprised. Thinking about the significance of the genetic connection again, right, the direct genetic connection, it seems to me there are at least 2 ways in which you can sort of cash that out. One is, let's assume there is evidence that all other things equal, having a direct genetic connection leads to a better parent-child relationship and therefore a better chance. I think the parents' interests matter too, and a better chance for that child. I have no idea what the evidence is on that. But let's say that were true. So then you've got one counterweight. And the second is, to what extent ought we to provide reasonable deference to a parent's deeply felt wishes and desires? And, in this country, we go a long way in that direction. So you've got those 2 things that are counting. Now, the risk of 5% of autism spectrum disorder, what's the population risk of autism spectrum disorder? 5% might not be all that far off, is my guess. So let's make it 10% then.
Yes.
Okay. We used to work together. I knew his mind works very well. There's a point at which you'd say, well, it's just too high. And the disease is too serious and the risk is too high. Those other factors just are outweighed. I don't know where that point exactly is reached. But we do have on the other side of the ledger the desire for this connection and the deference that we in this country and other countries we give to that desire, and this at least theoretical possibility that just something to be said. I've raised biological children, although we do have in our family adoption featured as well, and I think those children are loved every bit as much. I'm grateful for the genetic connection. I don't think I would have loved my children any less in the absence of it, but that's a counterfactual.
I'm going to ask, because we've got 4 people on the list still to ask questions and only about 10 minutes, I'm going to ask we all try to speed up both questions and answers, having already taken everybody's time with my own. So, Laurie, you wanted to say something.
Well, much as I love counterfactuals being a Talmudist, right? and love. The actual fact is you're asking a different question than the Newfield report. The question the Newfield report did, could you use this as treatment, using the treatment words? The question that this committee is asking is it acceptable to create a phase 1 clinical trial? At which point you might have to consider doing this even if the risk is 100%, right? Because that's the way to think about it. It could be 10%, it could be 100%, right? And so that under those conditions, is this an acceptable clinical trial? But the rate that it has to be, you have to be willing to take on 100% risk of serious genetic or serious physiological consequence.
I'd like to add just a quick thing too. I think it's one thing to wrestle with these, percentages and things like that. And again, that's not new too, because we've seen that with the genetic therapies for SCID, severe combined immune deficiencies, that led to a rather significant success rate in one sense, but then of course you had another significant risk afterwards of those same children who were successfully treated coming down with leukemia. So how do you balance that? Back to the Talmud for that. Okay, the other side though of this is, what are also the social consequences of this? And this was one of the questions that was asked. I didn't get a chance to mention it in my talk, but I think it is important. So I was at a meeting about 10 years ago, and we were talking about reproductive technologies, genetic engineering, and all that. And one of the presenters at the meeting mentioned the fact that he was the proud father of 2 children with cystic fibrosis. And another presenter at that meeting blurted out, "That's unconscionable." So how do we deal with social expectation based on technology? If that kind of intolerance and insensitivity could become even more prevalent in a society because of the ways in which these technologies are being presented or rolled out, is that what we want? And so not to say that that's not there, because it is there. This is not a counterfactual, this is a reality. So how do we wrestle with that part of the equation too?
I've got Marni, Jeff, Laurie, and Vamsi. Marni?
So I have questions on 2 separate issues that several of you touched on. One relates to the egg donor risk that several of you brought up, so specifically Kevin and Tom. Kevin, you said that you invoked the issue that there's egg donor recruitment as an issue for these procedures, and then you said the acceptable alternative would be to use an egg donor. But isn't that the same risks when you're using an egg donor for somebody with mitochondrial disease to replace their egg versus to do a procedure on it? So I wasn't sure why there was this line being raised that it's a risk for the procedure to have donors, but that it's not a risk to the alternative to the procedure, which is also an egg donor. So that, and then the other part of it was, I think, Tom, you said that, the issue that you'd want to get a close relative to be the egg donor, but I don't think that's necessarily what you want in this situation because of the risk that they also have the same mitochondrial DNA disease. So I was just really interested to hear just a little bit more about why there's this ethical difference, or what is the risk to the egg donor, I guess, for this procedure as opposed to any other. So that was one. And the other side of that was this issue of the cytosol, being important to the inheritance. But in my mind, I would love to hear your thoughts, I guess, on the ethics. People get bone marrow transplants, even in the first week of life. And doesn't that also introduce the cytosol at a very early age that becomes adopted? So I was wondering why the cytosol became such a big issue. And then I guess the final point was this issue that I thought Laurie raised, which was so interesting, about a moral obligation to cure. And I guess I was interested if that's acceptable in all religions, that the goal should be to cure and not just treat. If there is this history, I guess, of what you were talking about, that you shouldn't just accept, you should heal, and then if you could cure, is cure an obligation? So those are my 3 issues. So the egg issue, and then, sorry.
Marni, we need to speed up the
Sorry,
time.
so those are the issues. Those are the questions.
Again, I'm not sure. I apologize if there's any confusion. No, I'm definitely raising the egg issue in terms of how will that be addressed. I don't
But doesn't I guess my question is, doesn't it exist already when
Oh,
you
it
use
does.
an egg
Yeah,
donor?
but I think it's a huge issue already. Yeah, and so I'm not saying that everything that's going on now is fine.
Oh, I see.
I think it's an enormous issue right now, and I think part of the problem with having a clinical trial, again, if you run it as a clinical trial, how could you ethically offer anything but the best eggs? And that really reduces, the population that you're going to shoot for. And that's already a population that we've already been encountered that's a very controversial thing. These young women at colleges, including Georgetown, see ads where they're offered tens of thousands of dollars for their eggs. And so what are the ethical ramifications of that? And how will that be addressed in a clinical trial that would be developed? Secondly, your other question, I'm sorry, was cytosol, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
and the bone marrow transplants. Yeah, I mean, that was an actual issue with bone marrow transplants in terms of you're creating a chimeric individual. You've got now an individual with 2 genomes. Now, of course, the justification was seen as, otherwise this person is going to die. All right, so without this bone marrow transplant, this infant is going to die and die relatively soon. And there is no other alternative. If there were another cure, right, we probably wouldn't choose that drastic or dramatic or dangerous a course, right? So, I mean, the issue of curing, I would love to have a cure for these mitochondrial diseases. Not just a selection, a cure, a treatment, a direct treatment so people who have it now could be treated. That, I think, is the goal.
Because we're running short on time, and because I know at least one person's question is related, I'm going to ask Laurie and Vamsi both to ask their questions so that you can see the whole picture and respond to all of them, so that we get everybody in before the end of the session.
So one of my questions, at least, is related to Marni's question, and it goes to Laurie. And if you can answer it now, great, or you can submit your answer. But I think you mentioned something around the clinical trial issue, that the first use of any technology has a guarantee of failure associated with it. And it made me think about something Heather said. Patients like her see this as a cure for her future children. And so I guess I was curious why you see it as sort of the clinical trial aspect as a guarantee of failure. So that was one question I had. And the second goes to something that Marni said, and directed towards Kevin, which was, I thought you mentioned something around medicine, or something around this, as the medicine being, the goal being care. And I guess I wondered why the goal wouldn't be prevention or cure versus just care.
Vamsi?
So as a part of our process, the IOM also solicits commentary from the public, and so there's a fair number of emails that were sent in over the last few days. And I would like to just hear a response to one of the statements. I'm going to quote from one of the notes that was sent in, and I would love to just hear what the response might be, either now or subsequently. And so this individual says, in reference to MRT, and I'm quoting, "Note that the focus has already shifted from the child's well-being to that of the prospective parents. The child bears all the risk in genetic engineering that would be used to fulfill parental desire." So I'd like to just hear response to that comment.
So maybe what we'll do is just go down the line so that people can respond to the last questions as well as give any final thoughts, all within very, very little bits of time.
So I'll go ahead and answer that just very quickly. I do agree with you that the child does bear a significant amount of risk, but as a...
Just to be clear, I'm quoting.
Oh, sure. As a parent, I believe that it's very important that in every decision that we make, that we weigh the benefits to risk. And I believe that any time you perform a procedure such as IVF or PGD, that the child does assume potential risk if a mistake is made or a genetic, alteration is introduced. So I do see the point of that. However, you again have to weigh it against if you have a child that's born with me loss and the potential mutation that they have. And I've seen children that have died very young. I belong to an organization where we've seen that occur. There are children in wheelchairs and on respirators. So you have to weigh that again.
Quickly, the reason I said the goal is always care is because in medicine, it's often the case that we cannot cure. And we still, at that point, do not then throw up our hands and say, oh, we're done, and wash our hands of the patient. The point is you can always care. Up until the point of death, you can always care. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind and to keep that as the goal and say, what is the best alternative here we have now for caring for all of the people involved? And again, with something this complicated, it is, not just the nuclear donor, it's also the egg donor, if we want to use those terminologies, or seller, or however we want to put it. But there are many, many people involved, and we need to take care of all of their concerns and their risks when we go forward with this. And again, so that gets back into trying to look at this more comprehensively.
I think I'll focus just on the comment that you read. It may prove too much. I mean, I would want to ask that person, so what principle would you use to determine when it is appropriate to bring a child into this world and when is it not? Because if it's to bring a child in only if circumstances were absolutely optimal and there was close to zero chance of any disease, there probably wouldn't be many children in the world. So we have, that's part of that would begin a conversation about what reasonable levels of risk are permissible as a function of deep parental desires.
Thank you. I could just make a couple of observations that I think, as a committee, and in considering these issues, you'll need to be careful not to import into this issue some questions that actually don't belong to it, or that are bear upon lots of other areas of healthcare, and rather focus clearly on what is distinctive of this. The question about egg donation and whether tens of thousands of dollars acts as an inducement to young women to donate eggs is not something that is a function of this particular treatment. In the UK, we have a regulation that says women can be paid a maximum of £750 for donating eggs, and that will cover all their expenses. That's about $1,000 or so. So it's not something that is a problem intrinsic to this. Neither is the question of whether it's a treatment or cure. There are lots of areas of healthcare where we try to avoid, we try to treat, we try to cure. We would, like to do one and all of these things in all of these areas. So I think of course, these are not irrelevant to this particular question, but they're not unique to this, and they are not the characteristics of this that distinguish it from other things. Just as the context in which it would be introduced is not akin to the phase 1 clinical trial, which is about drug development. It's more about individual procedures that are introduced outside of that frame of drug development. So I think we just need to get the framing and the questions that are specific to this clear.
I agree with much of what's already been said, but I want to make a few points. I didn't say that first-in-use human trials are doomed to failure. I said they contain within them the construct that they are there to achieve knowledge. They're there to get to the point that Jeff Botkin alluded to, that we would know through trial and error, it's an experiment, then you learn as much from failure as you learn from success, and that's the kind of thing this is. That's the kind of decision this is, which is different from the Newfield frame that the Newfield report took. They said this treatment would be acceptable, would be ethical under these circumstances. This question is this a ethical clinical trial to take on? Can it be done? And like many clinical trials, including most of the ones undertaken in genetic medicine, statistically and empirically, they don't succeed. Right? They don't succeed. You learn a lot, but they don't succeed. And that's why they're a small n, and that's why we very carefully do informed consent. So that's what I meant by that, the tragedy of it. Secondly, Jewish law does have a very strong imperative to heal and to cure and to treat in all forms. That medicine is taken because of the weak appeal for an afterlife. There's a strong appeal for doing every single thing. What I'm asking in this project is there limits to this? This project asks us to undertake the possibility of something that looks a lot like cloning, much more than transplant or transfer. is that a step that we are ready to take for this disease at this time? And does that fall within the rubric of the imperative to heal or not? And I think that's a question that needs to be debated. And finally, yes, the child does bear all the risks, but that's true for almost every decision I make on behalf of my children, right? I make the decision, and they bear the risk of my decision, vaccinate, non-vaccinate, whatever. What is at stake here is whether whether it is the final idea, whether the powerful historical idea that you want to have a child now connected to the awareness of nuclear DNA, whether that's a good idea anymore, whether that's a defensible idea, or whether it's a sufficient idea, however powerful, however deeply felt, and however legitimate in many cases, is that a good enough reason, as the sole reason, to continue along this path? Because I'm on the rack, I see many, many yearnings, many, many varieties of deep and powerful yearnings on behalf of children. Not all of them can be considered legitimate ethical appeals, and I think that's what's at stake for your committee.
Well, thank you all. The bad news is we're a little bit behind in time. The good news is you have helped begin the conversation, and the rest of our workshop will give us an opportunity to drill more deeply into some, if not all, of the things you've raised. So thank you all very, very much, and we hope you'll stay with us for as long as you can, and maybe we'll have an opportunity to talk more. All right, so let's take 15 minutes, which on my clock would bring us back just after 10 minutes till the hour, and we will reconvene with session 2.